Thrilled to be here. And, I've been on this journey and it goes way back to when John and I were working together many years ago at Bank of America. Why is it that some companies are innovative and adaptive and others aren't? Like, this is a question that I have played with for a decade and a half now, and have conducted, immense amounts of research on, which manifested ultimately into the book that you see in front of you. But it was just super intrigued by, why is it that some companies can continually adapt and refresh themselves through innovation, through different thinking processes, and others simply do not? And with a group of academics, we entered into that question and analyzed, well over, it's over 100 companies now, all Fortune 100 companies, thousands of interviews, and tons and tons of network analysis. And you're already going to get a sense for what this presentation is going to be about. It's shifting from human capital to social capital. Something we weren't looking for in this particular question when we entered into this journey was, how do people network together? But it ended up becoming a theme and a pattern across a decade and a half, or I would say the first 5 years. And then we started to anchor into it. So I think this concept is even more important today than it was even 10 years ago. Whenever we start to think about, how do we show up in a virtual work environment? How do we connect across this thing called Zoom with the same level of precision and perhaps depth to be able to be both productive and innovative? And that's what I hope to focus on today. So I gotta trace back the journey a bit to do that, but I'm gonna try to anchor it into current events as best as I can, especially around the concept of innovation. And I'll tell you why I'll focus on that concept here in a few moments. But I need to go back to tell the story. We were looking at a financial services organization, the academics, and this was actually an integration. This was actually a merger between two companies, two small departments, so not the entire organization, but this was a network analysis, and we discovered something by mistake. We were interested, the story we were tracing was a small entrepreneurial company, the blue dots that you see in the bottom right-hand side of this graph, was absorbed or acquired by a larger organization that was an execution engine. And, the purpose of the larger entity buying the smaller entity, and you would know both of these names, was that the larger organization bought the smaller organization because of its entrepreneurial ingenuity. And this is about 6 months into the arrangement, if you want to call it that. And you can notice right away that not much has happened 6 months in. Fact is, in this particular case, there may be about 10 to a dozen people that are interacting on a routine basis here. Each of these are individuals, and reality is it's their job to interact because they're part of the integration team. So you understand this story maybe at this point. Maybe you've been part of a company or a merger at some point in time, and I'm going to get to a point in just a second, but you know the story at this point. The larger entity is saying, why did we spend so much money on this smaller company? And the smaller company is saying, how in the world did we let this happen to us? So this is not a marriage made in heaven. This is quite a miserable experience at about 6 months in. But I want to fast forward 9 months later, and I want to show you what happened. So this same company, same two departments within this company, the only thing that really happened here was a handful of the people that were in the smaller group were very talented, very smart individuals. And they were picked up and integrated back into the mothership, if you want to call it that. And something, so that's a big talent play, but something came along for the ride. All of a sudden, the very same ideas or the very same entrepreneurial ingenuity that the large mothership purchased the small group for started to flow in and out throughout this organization. And all of a sudden, there started to be innovation breakthroughs. By the way, we weren't looking for this. This was discovered as a result of looking at some of the network analysis and noticing that one of the things that started to happen was, as people were pulled in, innovation and ideas came along with them. So this was a mistake, this was a discovery, but we then started to notice this pattern over and over and over again. Here's another illustration of the same pattern, only in reverse. And this was a medical devices organization. I won't spend a lot of time on this chart, but you can see a bunch of individual entities by Kellers. These are different functions and departments in this large medical devices organization that you would know. And then you can also see sort of right in the center, this cluster of small white dots. So we're actually about 35 of them. If you would have gone and visited this group, which I had the privilege of doing, you would have looked at this group as the innovation hub of the organization, a centralized innovation team that did everything you could imagine by the book. You know, they had design thinking experts, they had a design studio, they had all the prototypes, they had, you know, an R&D lab with PhD scientists, and they had all these working prototypes that were just absolutely brilliant. You would have walked through this lab and you would have said, wow, these are really intriguing, disruptive ideas. They also have one other thing. They had a commercial success rate of 0 across a 3-year time period. You know, and so you know what happens. You know how this story ends. You know, if you're not producing, you're not going to survive. And the decision was made to diffuse this group. And it's very similar to the previous one, although in that case, they were pulled in. In this case, they were pushed out. You can see the network diagram after people were diffused out into the organization. And all of a sudden, those very same ideas that were central to the original group, they were conceived in this small group, started to pop all across the organization. So the reason I share these two stories is to say, when it comes to innovation, social capital matters. When it comes to innovation, the way you're positioned inside of an organization might be as important as the idea itself. You know, and there's great academic studies that have looked at this across time. So really, what I really want to emphasize in this presentation is, how do we think about social capital different? How do we think about network arrangements differently? And it's even more nuanced than that, because, you know, to get to social capital, we need to say, okay, so what is it? And it turns out there are two primary types of social capital that I'd like us to think about. This is another network diagram. This is actually a network diagram from General Motors. You can see in the center, there's this gray blob. You know, this organization is really good at executing this blob. It's kind of the, what you would consider to be the execution arm of this particular organization. And then you can see these little clusters on the outside. You know, oftentimes those are called incubators or accelerators inside of an organization. Most organizations get those two moves right whenever it comes to innovation. There's the operational engine that pays the bills, and there are these incubator bets or accelerator bets that oftentimes we partition off. But what they miss is the second piece, which is the bridging connections. And what I want to do is spend some time talking about the benefits of two different types of social capital. First type is what we call bonding. Bonding social capital is what you see in these small little pockets. Bonding social capital is kind of like the super glue that keeps teams together, keeps them moving fast. And in the agile world, we know, based on some science that's been conducted, that these small, agile, cohesive teams can move 10 times faster. You know, we call that iteration. We call that rapid design. You know, you can use all kinds of different methodologies like Scrum methods or whatever else. What we know is these groups are really good for doing rapid experimentation and iteration. And they can move much faster than that blob that you see on the left-hand side. The problem is that's often where we stop. You also need, when you're thinking about adaptive organizations or innovation, you also need to think about the second type of social capital, which is what we call bridging social capital. And the bridging social capital keeps those things on the edge loosely connected in such a way that they're not completely separated from the organization, but they at least have the autonomy to be able to move fast, but connected enough that at some point in time, just like in the two illustrations I shared with you, they're going to be pulled back in to the groups that can influence, you know, the scaling of those ideas. So bridging social capital does two things. It helps with discovery. We'll call that ideation for a moment. And the research says that you get 25% more insights if you've got these bridging connections. It also says that it helps with scaling. So if you can get these ideas pulled into the blob, then you can make them the new normal in such a way that you can actually do disruptive innovation across time. So this is the only theory slide I have in the entire chart or entire deck, but I just needed to ground us a bit in order to really help us think about different types of social capital. And let me put that in the innovation literature for a moment. Ideation. So ideation is basically bridging connections. We need to have bridging connections. We need to get outside of our day-to-day interactions in order to discover new things, in order to garner new insights. Something like design thinking is brilliant for that, because what you end up doing is you go out into the wild and you find out things that your intact group don't think about every single day. You discover that. But that's not enough, because frankly, ideas are cheap. You know, we have lots of ideas every single day. We oftentimes have lots of discoveries every single day, but you've got to bring those into the world. And the way you bring those into the world is through this incubation and or development phase, those small little pockets on the edge. That's where bonding social capital is so important, as I mentioned already. And then finally, the third move is to take those ideas out on the edge. The stats say that they're 46% more likely to be rejected because they're created on the edge, unless you're very, very intentionally building those bridge connections. And that's where you scale. That's how you scale. And it's through these bridging mechanisms that you begin to scale. So I'm going to pause just for a second and say, this is even more important in the virtual world. Knowing these three patterns, knowing these three moves, and thinking about them very intentionally is even more important in this virtual landscape that we're operating in right now. And I'm going to circle back to that in a few moments and give you some stats. But understanding these three moves is even more essential today, because they don't happen nearly as naturally as they do when we're in a face-to-face world. But to do that, let me sort of set the groundwork for where we are today, if I could. We live in very interesting times. You've probably seen this and have heard this. I don't know if your organizations have experienced this, but it turns out that we are actually being more productive today than we were before. It turns out, and this is just one study, it turns out that we actually have seen productivity increases, since we've been in this COVID world in the United States in particular. It actually plays on a little bit differently in Europe, and I can come back to that. But here in the States in particular, we've seen increases of up to 47% in actual productivity output being produced for knowledge workers in particular in this virtual environment. A couple organizations I've studied have said that they're actually producing, the average human being is actually working about 8 hours more, or is at least producing 8 hours more on a weekly basis. So think about that. We've added, and arguably we've added a 6th day of the work week just based on the hours, the reduction of transition times from meeting to meeting, the elimination of commutes. You could, and I'm sure you're experiencing this. I'm sure your companies are feeling this as well. So it's easy to have a knee-jerk reaction, and I've been part of these conversations with many companies. It's easy to have a knee-jerk reaction and say, wow, maybe like this is the new normal. Through Zoom and Slack or Teams or other virtual tools, like maybe we should just go virtual forever. And I'm here, like if you hear nothing else I have to say today, I'm here to warn you against that. Not because I don't think that we're going to be entering into a new normal, but because that I think it's premature to jump there without thinking about the other dimensions of which I just showed you as it relates to innovation and long-term consequences or outputs. So my whole core premise is to make an argument that yes, we can be more productive through virtual means, but that's not enough, because we lose generativity and we might even lose some of our ability to scale and integrate across the broader organization. And I'll come back to that. But to do that, I've got to have a little bit of fun with you. So who's this? We all know who this is, right? And I can't have you interact quite the same as I would if we were in a room together. But I would ask you the next question, We all know who this is, but what is he best known for? What is Kevin Bacon best known for? And rarely I get, very rarely I get Footloose. Almost always I get, well, 6 degrees of separation. We think of Kevin Bacon and we think almost automatically about 6 degrees of separation. And just to lay it out there, the story or the theory is this: Kevin Bacon is no farther removed from any living or deceased actor or actress than 6 degrees of separation. It actually turns out that that number is much tighter than 6 degrees. The actual number is, if you're interested, the actual number is 2.98 degrees of separation. And Kevin Bacon is uniquely positioned in such a way that he is super connected to other people. So I oftentimes then ask the question, what is it that's unique about Kevin Bacon? And people will say things like, well, he's got a very large network, or they'll say things like, he's been around since the beginning of time. And those are both true, but not complete in regards to what makes him so unique. And the real answer with what makes Kevin Bacon so unique, and this is critical to innovation, the real answer is Kevin Bacon is uniquely positioned in his network. And if I were to just compare this, and it has nothing to do with the size of his network, but if I were to just compare him, this is not real data, by the way. Everything else from here will be. But you could basically make an argument that Jim Carrey, who's been around approximately the same amount of time, has been locked in to one network group, one cluster. We'll call that the genre of comedy. What makes Kevin Bacon so unique is this: he has worked across all kinds of different genres, everything from dramas to Footloose to romance comedies to the voice of Balto, for goodness sakes. And what makes that so unique is it gives him different competitive advantages. And a sociologist by the name of Ron Bart has been studying this for years. And basically what he says is Kevin Bacon is a broker. And as a broker, Kevin Bacon has 3 unique advantages, very unique advantages. One is he has access to new information. He has early access to novel information. In other words, he sees things sooner than other people do. And I'm going to give you another illustration of another person that was a broker, and you'll get that point even more later. Second point is he has access to diverse groups of information. So much like if Kevin Bacon was in the organization, he would have access to finance and marketing and sales and production, or engineering or design, which means that he has the third advantage, which is he can translate different pieces of information to different groups in such a way that he can transport ideas to and from pockets of the organization. Well, turns out that's critical to innovation. We call that bridging social capital, as I've shared it already. And bridging social capital is absolutely crucial to network ideation, or networking for ideation. It is these bridge connections to and from these groups, the red dots that I show here, that really help ideas flow in and out of groups. And it's really where ideas come from. Frankly, if we work in the same homogeneous group day after day, we end up losing creativity. We end up becoming quite boring, if you want to say it that way directly. The reality is these bridge connections keep this richness of insights flowing to and from. And one of the ways that you manage that is you just simply move to the edge. Like if you want to discover new ideas, you move to the edge of the network. And that can happen both inside an organization where you can discover and transport ideas, but it can also happen outside of the organization. So one of the things about the blob is the blob continues to reinforce the current status quo or thinking processes. So if you want to invent, you want to disrupt, you want to create something different, you've got to peel off from the blob. One of the ways you do that is using things like design thinking. So this is a real story that I was part of. While I was at General Motors, we took 7 people, and actually sent them out. The 8th one there was me as their facilitator, if you're wondering. We actually sent them out into the wild and we said, what does urban mobility look like? And just to tell you a little bit of backdrop, right, on General Motors, General Motors is extraordinarily good at producing trucks. They really understand how to produce, sell, operate the best trucks in the world. Ford might argue with that, but you get my point. Now, all of a sudden, when you start to realize, especially pre-COVID, that most human beings were migrating towards cities, we call that urbanization. Nearly 70% of the developed world city or developed nations populations live near cities and are migrating towards cities. That might be a problem if you sell trucks, out in the rural area. And it might be a problem if you aren't really thinking about modalities of mobility inside of cities. So what General Motors did was they sent these 7 people out into the wild to study what's happening with transportation in Manhattan and San Francisco and Atlanta and these other large cities. And what they came back with was a new idea. What if we actually were less worried about selling vehicles and more concerned about creating a mobility platform where people can easily, at the click of a button through an app, transport from point A to point B. Now you might say, well, Uber does that. But the difference is that Uber and Lyft do that. The difference is, sometimes you need to get out of the city. Sometimes you need to move beyond point A to point B. And sometimes you actually want to have that vehicle for a longer duration, like to go to the grocery store and bring stuff back to your hotel or your apartment. So the reality is this platform, by getting out into the wild, was a car sharing platform. Think of it as Airbnb for your vehicle, which is a sunken asset that rarely is deploying its value because right now it's parked in some parking spot somewhere or your garage, and it's an asset not being fully utilized. But you could deploy that asset, just like you would with Airbnb, on a network in such a way that you solve a problem, you reduce friction in urban mobility, and you solve an assortment of problems. Like it's very expensive to park a vehicle, it's very expensive to own a vehicle, and if you could keep that vehicle moving around the city and you could just leverage some portion of it, you would be able to solve a mobility challenge that hasn't been solved in the world. Why am I telling this story? Because if your modus operandum inside the blob is to sell trucks and cars, you could already imagine that this will likely sell less trucks and cars. But if your goal is to actually enhance mobility, you build a platform, and there's a whole different play in the world in order to think about this kind of challenge. You only get that whenever you have bridging connections that are peeled off from the day-to-day. And this is why accelerators and incubators are so important. However, and this is my first real pivot into this virtual context that we live today. However, in the virtual world, we've got a little bit of a problem. And that is that the first type of social capital that begins to erode between bridging and bonding, the first type that begins to erode is bonding social capital. It turns out, again, citing some of Ron Burt's work, that 9 out of 10 newly formed bridge connections deteriorate within the first year. In a virtual context, we are already beginning to see this. In a virtual context, we're already seeing that linkages to customers are beginning to erode because you can't hop on a plane and fly to your customer. We're already beginning to see that collaboration across teams is beginning to erode because it's a lot harder to stay connected to other teams than it is to stay connected to your intact team. So this all of a sudden creates something that we call network fragmentation. So this is a healthy network. This is a vibrant network where you've got lots of bridge connectivity, and you've got some small clusters as well where things can happen fast. So new ideas are flowing in and out. You also have the ability to move fast. This is what it's beginning to look like in this sort of COVID virtual work from home model. The problem with this is it can easily show up as being greater in productivity. That upper group in the upper right-hand side is more productive than it was before. So the challenge we have in the world we live today is if we're measuring things based on purely productivity, all of a sudden things look better because what's happened is as you lose bridge connections, you lose distractions. And as you lose distractions, you become more productive, not to mention that we're anchoring in more hours these days. So you could easily deceive yourself, but the real long play is, can we continue to generate and bring in new ideas and then quickly diffuse those ideas or scale those ideas? That's a big question. And I want to continue to challenge you to think about that question. That's my primary intent for this presentation today. But let me, before I do that, remember it's about discovery. How do you get new ideas? I do want to talk about why these clusters are so beneficial. And to do that, I need to tell this story. You know it already. And I usually ask, who's this? And everyone knows automatically, Thomas Edison. And I also ask the question, like, what is he known for? And I gave you the answer. You know, and just in case you forgot, I gave you the answer. You know, we know Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, right? It's only partially true. Again, only a partial truth. I bet fewer of you have heard of these folks, the muckers. You know, the muckers. It turns out that Thomas Edison had the first agile work team that I know of. And he invented this concept of agile. We didn't know it. He's not credited for it. He's credited for all kinds of other things. But it wasn't, in fact, Thomas Edison at all who tested 3,000 different ways to make a light bulb fail or work. Actually, the literature says he did 10,000 different experiments. The reality is it was closer to 3,000. And it wasn't Thomas Edison at all. It was a guy by the name of Batch who was iterating and experimenting with different filaments. And the rest of the muckers were bringing their expertise. And they all played a very specific role. Some of them were glass experts, you know, doing the glass outer layer for the bulb. Some of them were material scientists. Some of them were electric experts. The first electrical generation system came out of Menlo Labs. So across an 8-year time frame, there were over 400 patents filed from Menlo Labs, and that happened through this agile band of muckers working together, iterating and experimenting on many, many different things well beyond the light bulb. You know, the first working microphone was generated. The first telegraph machine was invented there. First electrical generation system was invented there. And I want to talk about how these muckers brought things into the world. Most of these ideas existed. What they did was the ragtag group of muckers built things that could be commercially viable in such a way that they could be brought into the world. They took ideas, which were cheap, and they brought them into the world by creating commercial product. We now call that minimum viable product, in such a way that they were able to stand them up and make a difference in society through all the different inventions I shared with you. If you know this, then all of a sudden the way you think about inventing something for the future changes. And I'll tell that through this story. Here you can see a bunch of groups, you know, a bunch of clusters interacting with each other. This is a real network diagram. And each of these individual groups have different things that they're working on. And it turns out that this is exactly how self-driving technology is being invented today. You'll know that autonomous driving doesn't exist on the planet yet in a commercially viable way. But what Cruise Automation is doing, and this is the actual network from Cruise Automation, is they're iterating on this challenge on a day-to-day basis. Pre-COVID, 150 of these vehicles, you can see them on the left-hand side, 150 of these vehicles were driving around the streets of San Francisco. What they really are data collection devices. You know, inside each of those 150 vehicles is a database. That database has 150 terabytes of data on a day-to-day basis. That database is dropped into the BAT at the end of the day times 150. All that data is uploaded into this network of individuals, and these small ragtag teams that you see on the edge are iterating on their algorithms. There's a social team, or there's a sensor team there, there's a geo-mapping team there, there's a location team there, there's a devices team there, and each of those teams are iterating on their algorithm every single day with new data sets. So in essence, you've got a new product every single day. That's the way you bring very complex things into the world quickly. And just in case you're wondering, this group created four generations of self-driving technology in just 18 months. If you're wondering, it takes somewhere like 4 years to design a new vehicle and get it on the road. So you can see the difference between the blob and these small agile teams. We know that teams can move, we know that teams can drive performance and productivity through face-to-face interactions. And a lot of our friends, John and I in particular, are friends up at the MIT Media Lab, and Sandy Pentland have proven this for years, that small teams are super productive because cohesion matters. And this is, exactly what I think we're seeing today in this virtual world. This was a study that was done many, many years ago inside of a call center, and it basically looked at 4 different teams. If I could just share this real quickly, 4 different teams. And you can see the magenta team and the blue team. Then you can see a gray team and a red team. And right away, you notice that the 2 teams on the top are far more cohesive. They cluster together. They have bonding social capital. It turns out that 37% of the productivity could be explained alone by simple cohesion. And if you actually know that, then what you can do is try to make the other teams more cohesive. And what you do is you improve productivity. I think that's what we're seeing today. And in this particular experiment, by increasing cohesion by 30%, we were able to actually increase productivity by 25%. And what we've got to do is certainly we can incubate, which is the innovation movement in a virtual context. And it is much easier to hold on to those bonding ties or those bonding connections. But what we begin to lose are those 3 competitive advantages of brokerage that Ron Burt talked about. And just so I can share another illustration, if I could, that's exactly what Steve Jobs did. If you really think about it, Steve Jobs was the consummate broker, and I'm going to prove that to you here in a moment. And what he did brilliantly was connect the dots backwards. And this is actually Steve Jobs's network diagram. This was when the year that Steve Jobs passed. A friend of mine pulled this analysis based on patent data, and you can see Steve Jobs's network diagram. You can see where he is. This is only inside of Apple right here. And what you begin to notice really quickly is Steve Jobs was perfectly positioned as a broker. Oftentimes I would ask people to describe who Steve Jobs was, and they would say things like brilliant innovator, an incredible strategist, super creative. And I want to make a counter argument and say it was his network that did those things for him. And it is those bridge connections that are beginning to break down right now that are critical to, first, I've already talked about it, ideation, early access to novel ideas, access to diverse sets of information. You can see that in the Steve Jobs profile. But now, and just to make sure that I'm sort of spinning out on the final move, it also is critical to scaling. Steve Jobs was also able to connect those dots backwards and build something that other people couldn't build, and quickly diffuse it across Apple in such a way that they were able to be massively innovative in ways that we all know about. So this is the way this looks on the network. These small pockets in the bottom left-hand side are really good at bringing new ideas, minimum viable product into the world, but they're not good at getting it linked up to all the core stakeholders in the organization. So if you can find that bridge person, and you can continue to curate those bridges across time, what that person's able to do is activate the rest of the network, as you saw in my first 2 studies, in order to get these ideas diffused out across the organization so that we can continue to scale. And again, in a virtual world, this is my primary concern. In the virtual world that we live in today, we're already beginning to see that communication with distant colleagues is beginning to drift off. This was a study that was done in an article from HBR just a couple of weeks ago. 10% less communication to distant colleagues and 40% increase to closer teammates. You can begin to see the effect that I'm trying to describe here. What we need to do is continue to cultivate these connections, these bridge connections, because they are much harder to maintain virtually than than what we call the bonding connections. You know, if we allow it to emerge like this, you know, my concern is longer term, you know, the erosion of these bridge connections is going to adversely affect generation of new ideas and adversely affect our ability, much like what you saw with my first two case studies, our ability to get those ideas into the organization and scaled. So we constantly, and I'm going to land on this last slide and we'll have some dialogue since I've been moving super fast through this. We need to constantly be nurturing different types of connections. So I think of these as modalities. Adaptive space describes them as the discovery zone, the development zone, and the diffusion zone. You can see right away that discovery is about bridging connections and bridging social capital. Incubation is about bonding social capital and the muckers. And then ultimately, the Steve Jobs profile is about getting those ideas quickly scaled in such a way that you can stand up radically new product. I think of it like this. You know, let's discover a customer need. That happens really good in discovery, in defining what a unmet need might be, a latent need perhaps. Let's build it into a minimum viable product, a different set of connections. And then ultimately, how do we create a minimum viable operation or build a business model around the product in such a way that we can make an impact in the world? And the middle one is happening quite well today. My concern is, as I've said many, many times so far, is on the outer two edges. You know, how do we continue to get ideas and scale those ideas? And we're going to have to get much more creative with our interventions on those two dimensions in proceeding forward. So that was more than a mouthful, but I will pause there.